little bit of terminology. The first thing is CPT, which stands for Current Procedural Terminology. One of the questions when we get with ICD-10, of course, is how it impacts our CPT code. So just to kind of review what CPT is, it indicates what was done for the patient, not why it was done. It's typically a numeric value consisting of 5-digit code that's found on your claims. Examples would be the visit type, the procedures, or the labs. CPT codes are updated annually. However, there will be no significant change to them in October of 2015. So you'll continue to use the CPT codes that you do today, other than any updates that you may have just from the annual updates each year. So ICD, on the other hand, stands for International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems. And I think that definition of what it stands for is actually very telling of why we're making that change to ICD-10. It is the most widely used statistical classification system for diseases in the world. The use of the standardized coding helps improve consistency among physicians in recording our symptoms and diagnosis. And it is what we use on the claims to indicate to insurance carriers why something was done or provided to a patient. So what is the difference between ICD-10 and ICD-9? The first thing to note is that the ICD versions, the 9 or the 10 after ICD, just indicates the actual revision number. So even though the codes are updated annually, a major change to the structure is what we would consider a new revision, and that's why we are replacing ICD-9 with ICD-10, because as you can see here in this diagram, the actual structure of the codes is changing. There are 2 types of ICD-10 codes. I know there's lots of numbers out there about how the amount of codes are changing and things like that, but it's important to understand the 2 types of codes so you can more appropriately assess the impact it's going to make on your practice. So ICD-10-CM simply stands for clinical modification. There's about 68,000 diagnosis codes under ICD-10-CM. They're primarily used by physicians to indicate the diagnosis associated with the services that are provided. So they're used in clinical settings such as the physician's office. So for our small practices that are billing on a normal claim, these are the codes that are going to be impacting you. ICD-10-PCS, on the other hand, stands for Procedural Coding System. There's over 72,000 procedure codes, and those are used for inpatient procedure reporting. So it's primarily used in hospitals. While you may encounter them, you are likely not billing for them on your claims in the small practice. So just a kind of high-level overview of a comparison between ICD-9 and ICD-10. They differ in several ways. You can see under ICD-9, we are limited to 5 characters. We can now expand up to 7 characters in ICD-10. We had some more antiquated terminology under ICD-9. We'll be updating to more current terminology, where we used to be classified by injury by type. They're now injuries grouped by site and then type. There's an expansion of the chapters. Under ICD-9, there was only 2 alpha characters included, and that was either an E or a V to indicate injury or routine diagnosis. Under ICD-10, all the codes will now be alphanumeric, so they will, and we're not limited to just E or V. The whole alphabet is available. We didn't have it all under ICD-9 any code extensions for specificity and laterality, and a new feature to ICD-10 is that we now have dummy placeholders for the development of new codes in the future. Some examples of new features that are available under ICD-10 that we did not have under ICD-9, one would be laterality. So in the code itself, we can now indicate left, right, or bilateral in many cases. There's a whole new type of code called a combination code. So what used to be one single ICD-9 code, what used to be 2 different ICD-9 codes can now be reported under one single ICD-10 code because we're associating symptoms with the actual manifestations themselves. There's inclusion of new concepts that were not existent in ICD-9. And for our under obstetric codes, we're now able to identify the trimester instead of just the episode of care. And then there's been a number of codes that have been also significantly expanded. So some examples of those would be injuries, diabetes, and substance abuse. So one of the common things that we hear across the board is that there are just simply too many codes now under ICD-10. It's kind of easy once you see how the codes have expanded, why the codes have expanded. And there was an excellent presentation that CMS put out, and Dr. Joe Nichols made a comment in that presentation where he said there's a lot of words in the dictionary, but that doesn't seem to bother any authors. And I thought that was a great explanation of ICD-10. The expansion of codes can be related to the fact that there's over 50% of them that are related to the musculoskeletal system. 25% of those codes are related to fractures. Over 62% of the codes of fractures are simply distinguishing between left and right. And he also pointed out that there might be 1,800 codes for a fracture of the arm, and that could seem daunting, but there's really only about 50 concepts that are being used and repeated in different patterns. So the takeaway from all of that is a little reality check here. And that is that even today, with the codes that are available, only a very small percent of the codes are being used by most providers. So you saw in that example before, some of those changes that have increased the number of codes might not have the same impact on your specialty. Today, there's only about 5% of ICD-9 codes that account for over 70% of the charges. So even though the code sets are expanding, please don't be overwhelmed. As a general rule, all physicians, no matter what their specialty, are going to see an increase in the codes. But depending on your specialty, that impact can vary greatly. So there are some specialties where the number of codes that you're going to be using have gone up drastically, as you can see towards the bottom of this chart. Orthopedic, dealing with the musculoskeletal system and fractures and things like that, the number of codes has increased drastically. They're the most hardest hit, I guess you would say, by the number of codes that are available. But on a varying scale along there, you can see cardiology at the top, not quite as impacted. So again, depending on your specialty, that impact may be different. This is another great quote by Dr. Joe Nichols, and I just appreciated him, bringing it back to earth that there might be new codes that are available to us, but they're not new concepts that are being captured. It's just giving us a way to actually, deal with those concepts and actually communicate them through the code itself.